June 2019 Green Infrastructure, Climate, and Cities. For those of you joining online, this is, and those of you in person, this is a monthly seminar series sponsored principally by CC Run, but also all the partners shown on this slide. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, we usually have between 1 and 3 speakers a month who engage us on topics related to how cities are coping with the challenges posed by climate change and talking about a variety of different adaptation strategies and in some cases mitigation strategies as well. Those of you who are joining again for the first time, you can go back to 2014, any of the CC Run seminars. They're all on the CC Run website, and you can download them and look at them at your leisure. So this month, we have invited Ariella Moran, who has a long career, mainly in New York City, helping cities like New York and also cities around the country deal with the challenges of climate change. And so she'll introduce herself. So I'll just give the topic is the state of local government climate action in the U.S. So how are local governments responding? What are they doing? How are they networking? What types of things are within their jurisdiction? So what we'll do is Ariella will give her presentation, and then we'll have those of you joining online can submit your questions through the YouTube window, and we'll have someone read those, and those of you in person, feel free to ask questions right here. So thanks to Ariella. I will move over to her presentation.
Thank you, Franco. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you. Thanks for making time during what I'm sure is a very hectic week. I'm going to attempt this microphone, keeping it on the outside as I was just taught. Great. Hello. As Franco said, I'm Ariella Moran, and I'll be speaking about the state of local government climate action in the U.S., lessons learned, emerging trends, and next generation inspiration. It will be a little bit of a roller coaster / drama. There'll be highs, there'll be lows, but hopefully we all leave feeling like there's really positive stuff we can do moving forward. It is not always easy working in the field of local climate change because it can get very, I don't want to say depressing, but it's definitely a challenging space to be, but I love local government. That level of action is so special for so many reasons, and we're going to talk about that a bit. First, I'm going to give more of an introduction about myself. Franco suggested that might be useful. I'm an urban planner by training, and more on that in a bit, and I hear many of you both on the phone and in person are engineers. Is that so? Raise your hand if you're an engineer. Great. Everyone in the room, fantastic. But I hear there may also be urban designers, planners, and other interested folks and scientists. So hopefully you'll learn a lot about the public policy and regulatory framework that integrates your engineering knowledge into it to bring about change. So we're going to give an overview of local climate action today, discuss the urgency for transformative change, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the content there. Talk about progress to date, how are local governments actually doing, and then emerging inspiration. That's the high we're going to leave on. I get excited very easily, so narrowing down my emerging inspirations was really challenging. It's a bit long, so I'm going to look at the clock, and if it gets long, I'm just going to stop sharing and give you the opportunity to share, because I really want to have this be as much a discussion as technically feasible given the online presence versus in-person presence and the fact that many of you may be watching this weeks from now when you're done with all of your work. So a little bit about me. I have been working, so I graduated undergrad down the street south a few blocks exactly 20 years ago. And since then, much of my professional life has been in the public sector and in the private sector serving the public sector. I keep coming back to it. As you can see, a lot of that has been for the city of New York. I worked in the Department of City Planning as a land use planner in the Bronx office. The New York City Economic Development Corporation in the Energy office. And I helped create what at the time was called the New York City Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. Now it's just Mayor's Office of Sustainability, but a few related offices have also opened there. And then I got to learn what it takes to see a policy that you wrote and actually have to implement it in the ground, like actually have to make it happen. And that was at the New York City Department of Citywide Administrative Services. I was the Deputy Commissioner for Energy Management for the City of New York, responsible for approximately 4,000 buildings, 27,000 vehicles, 14 wastewater treatment plants, and figuring out how at the time to achieve the goal of a 30% reduction by 2017. 2017 greenhouse gas analysis came out, and guess what? 30% reduction achieved. So I'm very proud of that, even though most of it had nothing to do with me. It's all been my successors and partners, and what you'll see during this presentation, so much has nothing to do with actions of local government. They're just one really important part of the larger coalition that's needed to move these things forward. After that, I moved on to the private sector to work for a global engineering firm. Yes, I said engineering firm, Bureau Happold Engineering, where I helped lead the city's practice over there. And I continued there to work for the City of New York on climate action, leading the consulting group working on the New York City's roadmap to 80 by 50, and then their 1.5 Paris Agreement action plan. But I also worked with them on land use projects, resilience projects, coming out with Sandy success stories to help inform some of the post-Sandy planning that was happening. If you haven't read Sandy's success story, there is a case study related to Dr. Franco Montalto. It's fantastic. It's about stormwater infrastructure. But I also worked with the city of Cambridge, a little bit with Detroit, and a few other places. So as you can see, even when I was in an engineering firm, while there was some work on master development at different scales, there was still a lot on the local government side. I got to be honest, commuting to New York City from Philadelphia, where I moved in 2014, got a little old. So I decided to start my own firm here in Philadelphia called Line Advisors for Community Environment, where I'm the principal, CEO, and sole staff member. And I'm also a partner of CityScale, which is a consortium of former sustainability professionals. There's 3 of us who are partners. Michael Armstrong, who worked for the city of Portland for about 17 years, and Catherine Gajewski, who once was head of sustainability here in Philadelphia and now is in Chicago. And while we sometimes work on different projects, we talk so frequently that I think a lot of our feelings and findings get melded. So sometimes I'll be channeling those other 2 people as I'm speaking, and I'll reference some of their work as well. A lot of what I do, both for Line Advisors and CityScale, is a lot of listening. And most of who I am listening to are city government staff, as well as the people who support them and the coalitions around them. This includes numerous projects, including one we've done for C40 cities and the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, where we were just putting together peer review workshops, getting a small group of cities to come together and say, hey, how's it going? What are your real issues? What's really going on with your climate action goals? At the same time, I'm still supporting consulting efforts, helping people look at and figure out how they're going to get to carbon neutrality and how they're going to deal with climate change impacts on their communities and their infrastructure. So basically, everything I do has to do with ambitious climate action on the mitigation and adaptation side. I was fortunate to be part of the team that worked on Carbon-Free Boston, which was done by the Boston Green Ribbon Commission for the city of Boston to inform their climate action plan, as well as on the team for One NYC 2050, where more on that later on, but they're calling it New York City's Green New Deal. I've also been working with the Bloomberg Philanthropies on the American Cities Climate Challenge, and now as part of that, I am also working with World Resources Institute and Rocky Mountain Institute on a renewables accelerator, giving very specific technical assistance to local governments who are trying to do really ambitious things around renewable energy. There's a number of there seems to be a bit of a theme going on between renewable energy and what I'm working on, as well as on resilience, so it goes back and forth. But enough about me right now. At the end of this, I do have my contact information, so those of you who are students and have interest in different types of careers, both in engineering firms and tangential to engineering, I'm always happy to talk. Okay, so enough about me, back to local governments. So what does current local government climate action look like today? Well, first, does anyone know what I mean by local government? There's 4 of you in the audience, so I'm going to stare right at you. When I say local government, do you know what I mean? I'll define it. It's the administration of a particular town, county, or district with representatives elected by those who live there. The analysis I'm going to do moving forward is not going to focus on all local government, although I do have analysis on counties. I'm going to focus on municipalities and townships. Municipalities are their own, they have their own boundaries, and they have governance and elected officials within those boundaries. Townships are actually parts of other entities, but they have certain administrative tasks. For the most part, I'm going to say local government, and I mean cities, I mean towns and villages of a variety of sizes. So I'm just going to use it, and you'll know I'm not talking about. Question from Franco.
You don't mean utilities then. When you say local government, you're not.
I am not including utilities. I get to utilities, but the analysis I'm going to first show you is based on what the people who work for locally elected officials who are on staff to that city government, what they're trying to do, what's working, what's not working, how they're doing, and some ideas on how they can move forward more successfully, which basically means I gave away how they're doing. So now we know what a local government is. What are its powers and authorities? It's a trick question. It depends. The state, because we have a federalist system here in the US, the states determine the amount of powers the city has. The city or local government only has whatever powers the state says it has. And that's, very strictly Dillon's rule. It says, okay, city, you can do this, but I'm going to do everything else. Some states are more of home rule states, which give the cities much more authority to do things, but most are sort of a hybrid where you could do some things and can't do others. So what does a city do? Well, in the city of Philadelphia, you would hope it was working on the potholes, it's picking up our trash, it's working and administrating and operating our parks, taking care of residents. Some local governments are responsible for their schools, although some aren't. Sometimes that's the state. There's a variety of things, but for the most part, let's talk about some of the things that relate to climate change, which means energy, infrastructure, transportation, buildings, energy supply. Let's use Philadelphia as an example, which is where we are. Does the city of Philadelphia run the transit system? No, it's a state authority. It's a regional authority run by the state. The same thing in New York City. New York City does not run the MTA. Okay? You all got an A on that one. Does Philadelphia regulate the utilities? Mostly no. In most states, the states regulate the utilities. One utility, though, the gas utility in Philadelphia, happens to be municipally owned, so that's a little bit different. But if we use City of New York as an example, New York City doesn't have any municipal utilities. They're all regulated by the state. More. Does it set building codes? Typically not. That's mostly at the state level. But thanks to a great coalition of organizations here in Philadelphia, and eventually across the state too, the city did get permission to adopt a more aggressive building code than the rest of the state with the recent 2018 adoption of code. So that's new and that's huge, and that's one of those great examples of emerging inspiration to come. So, okay, that's a lot of what cities can't do. So why are local governments important? What good are they anyway? Well, as I mentioned earlier, I love city government because local government is where the rubber hits the road. If there are potholes in the street, I'm glad it's the city of Philadelphia's responsibility because they're right here and they live on those streets too. If they change the direction of a road, it's impacting the city who live there, and the city is the closest who does it. And local governments are elected by people who live right there, as opposed to, across the state or across the country. They're being represented by people voted right there. It really is where things come together. The real quality of life issues have to do with a lot of things the local government does. So there are lots of good. And we'll talk more about what that is. Okay, so one of the things I do as part of City Scale in my new world is, with thanks to Summit funding and Cerdna funding, those are two foundations, I have a database that was first created by Catherine Gajewski, and I keep it up in the middle of a 2019 refresh that's trying to track local government climate action across the U.S. And as a proxy, I am using engagement in certain programs. So it's not about having a plan and a commitment and your specific greenhouse gas inventory, because most local governments don't have those yet. It's using other proxies, and I'll for those academics out there who want to make sure everything's very scientific, I'll be sure to explain what's not scientific about this particular database and analysis. But what we found so far is that over 2,500 local governments, again, the municipalities and townships, are engaged in a program related to climate action. They are in all 50 states, and if you take their populations together, they make up 38% of the US population. And they're involved in over 80 national, regional, and state programs that I'm currently tracking in this database. And this is just a collage of some of their logos. This is not all 80 of them. But I want to give you a flavor for the types of programs I'm talking about. Some of them may be familiar to you, and not all of them, maybe. Some of them are agreements and commitment platforms, such as Mayors for 100% Clean Energy. It's a Sierra Club program, and mayors are signing up. They fill out a form. They don't have to know how they're going to get there, but they sign up and they're on there. It doesn't mean that every city that's committed to 100% renewable energy is on there, but for the mayors and their staff who officially signed up with Sierra Club, we have them. It includes the climate mayors, which is a group of mayors who came together after Trump said the U.S. was withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, and they said, no, we are going to commit to upholding the Paris Agreement. As mayors, we have a very important leadership role, and we're going to guide the nation towards trying to avoid catastrophic climate change. Similarly, We Are Still In and America's Pledge, also similar commitments from around the same time and funded by the same people. Some of them are more regional in nature. Those were national ones, like the Green Tier Charter in Wisconsin and Chicago area's Greenest Region Compact, where they're committing to a certain action and a certain compact agreement, and then are receiving some technical resources and support for getting there. I should mention across the different types of programs, there's lots of overlaps. All of them are a bit of a hybrid. The next category is networks. There's the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. 155 local governments are members of Urban Sustainability Directors Network across the U.S. And as a network, they share best practices. They discuss the issues most important to them, and are looking to learn from each other's practices. It tends to be pretty technical in nature. Part of that is another group called the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, and those are the few cities who said, we're going all the way. We're achieving 80 by 50, and now we're saying carbon neutrality, and we're going to work together to figure out how to do that. C40 cities started back in, well, it was C20 in 2005, and in 2007, when around the same time Plan YC came out, C40 cities really launched, and it's a global network of cities that really helps the mayors get together across the country. And, regionally, there's Green Communities California is just an example. Some of these groups that people belong to are technical resources, like City Energy Project, giving you templates on how to do things, holding your hand. American Cities Climate Challenge focuses on that as well. And then some are certifications, such as Sustainable New Jersey, Sustainable Maryland, Sustainable Pennsylvania. Those are all recent, new, and there's a theme there that is emerging. Anyway, that's just to give you an idea. These are the types of programs that are available for local governments to get support in moving forward on their climate action goals. What's fascinating is how many cities belong to multiple programs. That means their staff is spending time at workshops, conferences, on the phones, talking to each other. There's an amazing network of folks in the sustainability field in local government who talk to each other. They're good friends. I think they're going to each other's weddings across the country because they're all in this together. But there's also, a bit of overlap. I had to throw in this slide. It was something we actually did for a specific client that was trying to understand how their membership compared to others. So this is a 5-way Venn diagram. I'm very proud of it because I had to think a bit three-dimensionally on how to show. So each number is a number of cities with that specific membership. So what this is showing is that there are 30 cities that are members of all 5 programs that are here. So the Carbon Disclosure Project has 81 full members, and 30 of them are also members of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, the Global Covenant of Mayors, and Climate Mayors. So that's just for fun to show you what is going on. But let's talk a little about these cities, and then we'll go back to their level of engagement. Well, they're not all cities. They actually range from mega cities to villages. If we look at all of the engaged communities that are tracked because of their participation in these programs, if you look at their populations, 36% of them fall into mega cities, which are over 1 million people, or large cities, which is 500,000 and greater. So it's not so surprising. New York City alone is 8.7 million, so just that city participating is a big chunk of the US population. But if you look by number of engaged communities, and this is where things get really interesting, 74% of them are in towns and villages. A town has a population, at least as I have defined here, of less than 30,000 people, and a village is less than 10,000. What's really interesting to me are the villages that are super highly engaged. I'll get to this a little, but if you're all wondering in your head right now, because I'm sure you are, what village of under 10,000 could possibly be one of the leaders and most highly engaged? It's Aspen, Colorado. So a good reason to visit there in some carbon-free way. So this is interesting. So because there are so many smaller communities that are engaged, it brings down our average and our median. So the average size of the population of one of these communities is 47,000 people, and the median is just 14,745. There are a lot of small communities who are in some way engaged. They may not have a sustainability staff person, because I'm sure their local government's pretty small, or somebody may wear that hat who also does land use planning or energy management, or maybe even is the mayor or city council member. It's unclear, but they're doing something, whether it's an energy efficiency program, a certification, Department of Energy Soul Smart, Department of Energy's Better Buildings program. They're doing something that shows that they care about reducing energy usage or adapting for climate changes or anywhere in the spectrum of climate action. And they're not all liberal bastions. So I looked at this through 2 different indicators. And obviously it varies by size, but there's a lot to unpack there. So first, using the 2016 presidential outcomes as the indicator of whether you're in a blue area or red area, which, as you know, is imperfect because you could be in a blue community that's in a red county and vice versa. But just using that as a proxy, you can see for mega cities, well, 90% are blue, but guess what? That's because big urban cities in the US tend to be more democratic to begin with, right? That's just part of the trend of the cities, has nothing to do with climate action. Because basically, there's 10 mega cities and they're all up there. They're all engaged in some way or the other. With large cities, it's 88%, similar dynamic at play. But what's really, really interesting are the villages, where 55% of them are in counties that actually went Republican in 2016. So I did the same analysis using the party of the mayor where relevant. And the reason I say where relevant is there's different types of government structures, and sometimes there's a strong mayor who runs with a certain political party. Often it's a weaker mayor system where you have a city council or a set of ombudsmen or township council where they're elected, and then one of them will act as a mayor, or maybe it's just the council and the general. So a lot of places where it's nonpartisan, or it's unknown, or it doesn't matter, or they're so small that information is we're not able to find it because there's over 3,000 local communities in this database, and that's a lot to dig into, and it's not always there. So if I take out where there's actually a party that's either Democrat or Republican, which is just 23% of them, you can see the trend is the same. If you look down at villages, 49% Republican, 51% Democrat. So then I looked at the towns that are in the database that are not engaged, which includes, so I made sure the database includes every single city over 30,000 people, which is basically the top 1,000 cities in the country they're all in there, whether they're engaged or not. And of those that are engaged, that are not engaged, but are still in the database because they're over 30,000, it's actually almost even which ones have a mayor who's a Democrat and which is a Republican. So the point of all of this is, while climate change has become so political at the federal level and a little bit on the state level, when it comes to those quality of life and running a city operations on the ground, the politics seem to matter a lot less. Which is good, because you'll see when I move on to the states in a bit, back in 2005, when climate change wasn't as political, a lot of states were coming out with climate action plans and policies that they have since rescinded as things became more polarized in this country, and red became redder and blue became bluer and all of those issues. So more to come on that. All right. So we saw overview of engagement, but not all engagement is the same. There's different levels of engagement based on how I'm defining engagement here for this particular analysis. And actually 53%, so more than half of the engaged communities, are engaged in just one program. And that one program they tend to be involved with is something happening at the state and regional level. Regions matter. States and regions matter. Again, it's a political statement if a mayor says nationally, I'm committing to climate change. It's very different if you're taking advantage of opportunities for energy efficiency and renewable energy that are coming locally. And taking the politics out of climate change is pretty powerful. And we're seeing this is actually happening to some degree at this local level. But there's still a role here in that of those 88% that are just participating in regional or state programs, it's because they are in states that have very supportive programs, or there's a local infrastructure and civic capacity supporting it. So 62% of them are in the Northeast US. The largest membership organization is actually Sustainable New Jersey. Just the governance of in New Jersey, it's just lots of really small towns. New Jersey is not a state with big cities so much. It's lots of little towns. So if you get every single one of those little towns to sign up for something, to get certified and say, I'm committed, you're going to have a large number. And that's what we see in New Jersey. I'm from a town in New Jersey no one's heard of, so I can verify that there's a lot of small towns in New Jersey. The same thing can be said for New York State clean energy communities, Massachusetts green communities, and a few others. Those last two are actually state-run. So again, progressive state, you see a lot happening there. But what's also interesting, though, is how many are engaged in more than one. If you look where I felt the bend of the curve was, which is a participation of 4 or more programs, you have 258 local communities participating. And that represents over 54% of the population of the engaged communities. And then what's really fun is that there are 17 cities participating in over 17 programs, which makes up 20% of the engaged community. I've listed them there just in case you were really curious. And yes, Philadelphia is on there. New York is on there. These are actually in order of number of participation happening. So you have San Francisco, Boulder, Seattle, New York City. Some of it's a bit biased. If you're in an area that just has lots of programs, you're going to have the opportunity to sign up for more. Okay, let's move forward. So level of engagement, I think it's been a useful indicator, but it's imperfect indicator. Because what it's basically telling us is the level of activity in these programs, the general interest level in this type of work, and it helps us find trends. So for example, a few funders have asked for analysis that helps them figure out, well, how many communities do we think are interested in renewable energy in states with this type of regulatory structure, or who allow community choice aggregation, which is a type of energy procurement, or who don't allow community choice aggregation but have a deregulated energy market. So with this analysis, since it connects local governments, counties, and the state, we're able to say, okay, there's this number of cities that are interested in renewable energy because they signed up for this, we think as a proxy in this particular state. So it's useful for that, but it's not telling us what's happening on the ground, so please keep that in mind. It doesn't tell us the strength of the strategies they have, their success levels, community and political buy-in, and of course, civic infrastructure and local capacity, and all those things are hugely critical for success. All right. So for example of what it can show me, and then I'm going to move away from the database, is the level of engagement of the state, how the supportive the state is to climate action policies. It does matter. So 50% of the engaged local governments are in states with high or leading levels of climate action support. So this is determined by whether or not they have a renewable portfolio standard, whether they themselves have a climate action plan. It includes their score from ACEEE, which scores states on how they're doing in terms of energy efficiency. So using a proxy, we're able to put the different states into different categories. And yes, if you're in a state, that's very helpful. It's going to put more resources to get more communities involved. However, it's not a perfect predictor because I love this. Let me get the arrow. There it is, the circle. 55% of the highly engaged local governments are actually in states that provide moderate, low, minimal, or no support for climate action. Like Florida has nothing going on the state level. They are so not helpful when it comes to renewable energy, energy efficiency. You can't even use the word climate change in certain official state documents. I'm not making that up. But there are so many communities, and I should say the counties are showing great leadership there too, because they have a very strong county system there in this space. You know, they realize they're going underwater. They have climate action plans, clean energy plans. Orlando is so inspiring. St. Petersburg, Fort Lauderdale, they're all working together trying to move forward. So they're in a state, there's a great example where, you know, you wouldn't expect there to be a lot going on in Florida, and there is. But they need more help. Everyone does. Okay. So besides what we know in terms of this analysis of engagement, what are the type of activities these states are doing? And first, I'll discuss what they are, but then I have some really important questions. First, a lot of them are assessing baseline opportunities, whether they're doing a greenhouse gas inventory with the help of ICLEI or with the Carbon Disclosure Project, although they may not be doing it regularly. We found in doing a greenhouse gas analysis, this was my colleague Michael Armstrong, that we were able to find just 53 cities that had consistently put out enough greenhouse gas inventories that we can assess trends within in a 5-year time period. They're also doing building municipal audits. Where can they find opportunities for energy efficiency in their buildings? Many are developing plans and making commitments, sustainability and climate action plans. Perhaps it's because they're members of one of those commitment organizations that's requiring them to, or maybe they're doing it on their own. And they had been setting greenhouse gas reduction targets. Many are leading by example. You know, cities, towns are comfortable with their own operations. They feel like they have the authority to do that. They're often less comfortable telling the private sector what to do. They know their boxes, right? We know land use planning. I know some transportation falls to me, and I know my own operations. There had historically been a little bit of hesitation going beyond that, although we're starting to see that over the last decade, I would say. Many, as you saw, are participating in programs or supporting other programs done at the state level or utility level. Many are receiving technical support from U.S. Department of Energy, their state, utilities, and of course, they're participating in those networks I mentioned, both at the regional level and at national level as well. And they're sharing best practices. They're learning from each other at a very high level and figuring out how that could work in their place. And then a lot of them are implementing work around, you know, their sustainability plan or sustainability office. Why do we care? You know, is it helpful that they're doing these activities? Where is it getting us? Is it getting us anywhere? Are there implications to these actions? Do they come at an opportunity cost? You know, if we're spending all this time doing greenhouse gas analysis, is that time and money that we're not spending doing something else that maybe could be more useful with our limited time and staff and resources? Are there unintended consequences of what we're doing? Is this getting us to where we want to go? So hold on to those questions. Okay. Now shifting to the growing awareness of the urgency around climate action. Given that this is a seminar by CC Run, I'm going to assume there's a certain level of familiarity with the Rio Earth Summit and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and with the Kyoto Protocol and IPCC. Franco, do you think that's a fair assessment that this group gets it? Yeah. Nods? Okay, I'm not going to read through that then. It is interesting, though, to see the arc and how it's impacted urgency from, you know, in the Rio Agreement, this idea of precautionary principle. The science is uncertain, but we need to act. And then when the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, but the U.S. wasn't part of it, you had mayors led by the mayor of Seattle in 2005 saying, Conference of Mayors, we need to do something on climate if our federal government isn't doing it. So you have the Climate of Mayors and the Climate Protection Agreement, which had, I should say, over 1,000 mayors, actually 1,060 mayors from U.S. states, D.C. and Puerto Rico signed. To date, there isn't any other program or commitment that has that level of engagement in the U.S. And this was back in 2005. As I mentioned earlier, climate change was a little bit less political at the time. Not all of those communities are engaged right now. And what's interesting is when I analyzed who they were, it was actually pretty even Republican and Democrat. So I'm not sure if there's any conclusions there, but let's just say it has changed. Okay, so we have the mayors getting together and they created that climate action. Then we have in 2014, the IPCC fifth assessment comes out. We're seeing better science. We're understanding our risks. We know we have to go deeper and faster. You have the Paris Accord end of 2015, in December 2015 signed. I remember at the time thinking, we're going to save the world. This is great. And then in 2016, Trump pulls the U.S. out of the Paris Accord, and local governments are kind of at a loss. So they once again start with these different pledges, the We Are Still In, America's Pledge, Climate Mayors. How do we as cities take on this leadership role, knowing the newer science we have? Although I don't know how much the science fully sank in with everyone, although folks from C40 cities and others was trying to tell folks, hey, carbon budget, if we want to avoid catastrophic climate change, we all have to get to carbon neutrality. Maybe folks heard it, maybe they didn't. But then the IPCC comes out with this special report on 1.5 degrees, which is basically showing the difference between 1.5 degrees Celsius warming and 2 degrees Celsius, and the fact that everyone has to get basically to carbon neutrality very quickly. And all of a sudden, it was this big wake-up call, especially the policy paper saying we have to do more faster, even if no one else is doing. So there's this growing urgency, especially from the leading cities who have been really steeped in this space at this point for over a decade. This isn't new to you, so since this will be recorded, people can pause and read this, but basically saying, we're screwed. We got to do more. Okay, so a few cities, like the city of New York, recently the Green Ribbon Commission for Carbon-Free Boston, and a few other cities have done deep analysis to figure out what does it take to get to 80 by 50? Like, what does it really take to get 80 by 50? And now carbon neutrality. We made the commitment. Let's do the analysis. What's behind what I could do as a city? That relates to how we actually do greenhouse gas accounting, which is mostly Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Scope 1, of course, being what we directly emit within a city's boundaries. Scope 2, like electricity, is outside. Waste is Scope 3. This doesn't include embodied energy. This does not include consumption-based accounting. So given that, a few things are very clear to these cities. We need a renewables-based grid, if not 100%, then fairly close to it across the entire U.S. We need net zero emissions buildings, not just new construction, which we know how to do and some codes are coming out to support it, but even existing buildings. Every existing building needs to have a whole building deep retrofit that potentially includes a move to electrification, because we have to move away from all fossil fuels. By the way, we have to move away from all fossil fuels as part of these commitments, as well as deal with methane and other emissions reductions. So building electrification or some other no carbon energy source has to be part of it. But if you think about that, if you think about a city like Philadelphia, there's 700,000 buildings. Most of them are going to be these smaller row homes. A lot of them are old. They're inefficient. All of them need to be retrofitted, and not just lighting. I mean, these whole building deep retrofits, which means you basically need people to move out. Where are people going to move out? 27% of the city of Philadelphia lives below the poverty line. There's already affordable housing crisis. There's already this poverty crisis. Where are people going to move? How are they going to move? Oh, and by the way, not only is there the cost to consider, although many believe that financing is not the issue, there's a way of addressing it. You have buildings that are in such bad condition that the cost of such a retrofit is almost as much as the entire value of the home. And they have more pressing issues like the mold and lead and other public health issues. And by the way, these families are struggling and don't even know how they're putting food on the table and are often choosing between paying their energy bill in their inefficient buildings or getting medicine or food, right? So they have these pressing issues, and we're saying every building needs to be retrofitted. So that's just part of the challenge ahead of us. We also need to eliminate reliance on internal combustion engines. So of course, all good urban planners are going to say, and urbanists are going to say, get people out of their cars. We need more transit, bike lanes. We need more people walking, transit-oriented development. That's great, but you're still going to have most people who are in vehicles. So we have to get every vehicle to move away from the internal combustion engine. We basically need to move to EVs, think through the infrastructure, think through the utility rates related with that, where that infrastructure is going to be, how we're going to do it, and by the way, make it accessible and equitable because, of course, we don't want just the wealthy people to get electric cars and not have the same opportunities for everyone who needs mobility to access their job. So tons of considerations there, but we got to do all of it. And zero waste. Waste is such a small part of our greenhouse gas emissions, but without zero waste, which means zero waste to landfills, or at least 90% of the way there, we're not going to meet our target. So, obviously consume less waste, and recycle, but of course, trying to think of all waste as a resource. As the waste management trucks going through Philadelphia say, I don't know if you've noticed that, they all say, what if all waste was a resource? But between anaerobic digestion, composting, and other technologies, it's a growing area as we work towards this circular economy. But what the cities, specifically those who are doing carbon neutrality, are also finding is even doing all of this, it's technically not feasible to get to carbon neutrality without considering carbon offsets, whether it's forestation, reforestation, afforestation, soil management, land use. Because the way accounting works, we're talking about doing work outside the city's boundaries so that we're not double counting within our own inventories. And I could probably spend a whole hour talking about the different offset standards that exist, different conversation. But anyway, this is what the cities are finding are necessary. Just a few examples from Carbon Free Boston, just if you didn't realize how hard this was. This chart shows where historic emissions reductions have been. Most of that has been from improvement to the grid. And baseline, business as usual, our current path, is much higher than where the path to zero leads us. And this already assumes that Massachusetts, with its progressive state policies, is going to have an 80% renewables grid or clean energy grid by 2050, and still it falls short. So we have a long way to go. They also found, similarly, that we need to reduce demand for energy, maximize energy efficiency, electrify all activity, and use greenhouse gas-free and electricity. And we also know, Boston found this, but others, this is from the Center for International Climate Research, the longer we wait, the harder it would be. If we start, and this was based on actually just staying under 2 degrees Celsius, not 1.5, but if we had started back in 2000, we would have to achieve a reduction of about 3% a year. If we start today, it's about a 10% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions a year. If we wait 10 years, we have to figure out how to reduce 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions per year, which is probably infeasible. Just to put this in some context, in that greenhouse gas analysis study I mentioned earlier, looking at those 53 leading cities who have 2 inventories 5 years apart, the average greenhouse gas emissions was something like 1 to 1.4% a year. So not even a 3% a year. So there's a big gap there. This is really hard. But we know we have to do it. So who does what? Well, as I said earlier, city, so this is Philadelphia City Hall, has limited powers and authorities. You have the federal government setting CAFE standards, how clean our cars have to be. And by the way, those are not going in the right direction right now. Also setting standards for many equipment in terms of energy efficiency and heavy-duty vehicles. This is Harrisburg, the state capital, if you didn't recognize that building. The state, as I mentioned earlier, has the building codes, transportation, transit, and the utilities as well. There's so much pending legislation this month in Harrisburg related to renewable portfolio standards, energy efficiency incentives, allowing community energy, a whole bunch of stuff happening. But right now, Pennsylvania is definitely not a leading state in this area. It's one of the largest energy producing states in the country. If you didn't know, that's actually the number one producer and exporter of natural gas-based electricity, and I think it's the second largest energy producer in the state, but don't quote me on that, I may be slightly off. Okay, and we talked about what City of Philadelphia can do, but let's not forget, City of Philadelphia doesn't even own most of its buildings. Individuals own buildings, the private sector owns buildings, they operate buildings, they have their communities, they have their jobs, they have the way they travel around, they know what works, they know what they do on a hot day, they know how they deal with this. There's all the people, and we just can't forget the people. So we went through some of the challenges. So how are we doing? I think I sort of gave it away. We're not doing great. We're not doing well at all. So while cities are reporting lower emissions, the harder work is ahead. And a lot of the emissions that they're seeing has to do with changes to the electricity grid, and a lot of those were regional market changes. A lot of it was moving away from coal to natural gas because natural gas got cheaper thanks to fracking and other things. That was a lot of the dips that we're seeing. This is a quote from one of the cities that I had been working with. This woman in one of the sustainability office says, don't get so excited about reducing by that 30% reduction. The next 20% is going to be a lot harder. The grid is shifted, and now we have to work on individual actions. This is where we get to the buildings and the transportation. This graphic, which purposely doesn't have a key, for those of you who get very angry when there's no key, I didn't want to have the cities be compared, right? I purposely want to keep the cities anonymous, but it's an overlay of greenhouse gas emissions from Vancouver, Toronto, City of New York, San Francisco, DC, Philadelphia, and Chicago. You just can't know which is which. And you can see, they went down, and this is even while their populations were increasing, and GDP went up, and jobs went up, all very exciting. But it's somewhat misleading because the bottom axis is 60%, not zero. They all have a really long way to go. For the most part, cities are not on track to meet emissions reduction targets, and their specific city policies and actions, because they're all working really hard, are not yet moving the needle. They're not yet driving the reductions. Yet there's this growing awareness for transformational change. It's not about incremental change. And they also realize that while it was great to say when Trump pulled out of Paris that cities are the new leaders, cities will lead, cities actually cannot achieve their climate goals alone. They have an important role to play in leadership and planning and bringing people together, and perhaps we need to rethink what roles and responsibilities local government can play, but right now they can't do it on their own. So we know that there's a need for new approaches that focus on what seems to matter. Governance matters both within a city government, where a sustainability office is and how it relates to other agencies or where it sits. The internal and external support for the hard work, the alignment around city priorities. When mayors are running for office, they're not saying climate change is my number one priority. They have to reflect what the people are saying. The people are saying affordable housing, crime, education, potholes. That's what they're saying, and that's what are going to be the mayoral priorities. They're not saying climate change. So part of this is showing how actually, if you really care about equity, you should really care about climate change. They actually must go together. So that's governance matters. And it relates to this last piece too, around regions. So on governance, currently cities are acting on their own. While there are regional organizations, they're not set up for the type of action that may be necessary. So that's important to keep in mind. And often we may not have the institutions that are set up to do the type of work that has to happen. There's no institutions whose job it is to oversee retrofitting every single building in an entire city. Like that type of capacity just doesn't exist. We know that equity matters. It's increasingly viewed as foundational for all the reasons I mentioned. And again, I could spend an hour or two on this. But inclusive processes and equitable implementation outcomes that these cities are working so hard to figure out how to do, they're challenging at scale because they take lots of time and commitment, and that takes money, and that's often money that's harder to get. It's easier to get capital money for a solar panel than it is to actually get human personnel to do the type of conversations that need to happen. Communications matter. In fact, one colleague of mine says, what if we took some of that money we spent doing greenhouse gas inventories, instead put that around communications, or at least figure out how to do communications better? You know who's really good at communications? Utilities, right? So if there's a local government against a utility, you know who's going to win the communications battle? Right now, it's a utility, and we've seen that happen in a few cities across North America, where they've tried to be really aggressive, saying, we're moving away from fossil fuels, we're moving away from natural gas, and utility would come out and say, guess what, you're not allowed to eat food from a wok anymore, and all you small businesses are going out of business, and the city's being crazy, and people will listen, because they want to support their small businesses and their ethnic foods, and you're taking away my woks? Well, don't do that. That was a specific example. That wasn't my example. That was theirs. So communications matters, and we're really not doing a great job doing a great narrative. Talking about polar bears far away or talking about climate change years from now is not as compelling as talking about this river in our community that's so meaningful to us. Like, it touches me, this river. I can get around what's happening at this river, or I understand and can get around this certain issue. Climate change has not been one of those issues, so how do we get the communications part right? Coalitions matter. Cities cannot do this alone. They need to do a better job of building coalitions with the private sector across all communities, across all levels of government. We kind of need this wave of everyone moving forward and pushing and organized and aligned, because there's a lot of work to be done. And these are findings that are coming from conversations with cities, and specifically those workshops I mentioned earlier that I've been facilitating. This is what they're finding. And as I said earlier, regions matter. Land use, affordable housing, transportation, energy infrastructure, and markets, they don't all stop at the border of the city. They're regional by nature, and we just don't know how to address that. So we need to refocus. Okay, so with these findings, what are some of the emerging trends around climate action? Well, we're realizing that perhaps we shouldn't just be focusing on the indicator of greenhouse gas emission. While it's important to have a common indicator that supports scientific analysis and we can move towards it, that's still important. I don't want to say let's not track greenhouse gas emissions, but at the end of the day, the people voting, the people who are calling for the priorities, the people who are going to be the advocates are part of the coalition. They're people. It's our daily lives. It's turning on our lights. It's whether we travel on our vacations. It's how we travel to work. It's what we eat. We need to be people-centered. So I brought the people back. That's the extent of my graphic art abilities. And as part of that is having equality at front and center of climate action planning. This is dealing with historic racial bias and inequalities. Let's call that head on. We have land use patterns and building conditions and transportation access, all that. We were able to get a resolution to the board. The board did not pass it. Instead, there was some statement about some of the programs they are doing, which are likely not enough. But these employees publicly put their names out there and use their power as shareholders to get the attention of Amazon. And guess what? It made it in the news everywhere. If you Google this, there are thousands of articles on this. And I think we're going to see it again. I'm convinced something else is going to happen here. So, okay. Now, you may be thinking, this is about local government. Why am I talking about youth and grassroots? Well, as I said earlier, it needs a coalition. Someone has to be pushing the mayors, the cities, we have the voters. But also these two examples, these impact our day-to-day. If coal plants go under on their own because they can't get insurance, guess what? Our grid is cleaner, and all of a sudden all those other sources of energy are much more economic. And it's not just about greenhouse gas, but it's air quality, water quality, soil quality. That's great. With Amazon, their trucks are going through our cities. Their boxes are in our waste stream. They are changing the way we shop and move. They have a huge influence on the way local governments operate and its emissions. So again, this might not specifically be city government, but it shows how we need action by everyone. I already gave this one away a little bit when I talked about the Green New Deal, but I want to discuss a little bit more about the significance. For years, as someone who's been in this field for a while, climate change would not make it into elections. In 2016, I was so hopeful it would. I think there was one town hall question where that guy that everybody fell in love with, he said he was a coal operator, and what happens if we move away from coal? And Trump said, I love coal. And Hillary Clinton said, well, gave a very policy important question. That was the closest thing to a climate change conversation we had. People were scared of it. They stayed away from it. That is no longer the situation. When Beto O'Rourke came out with his first policy memo as part of his campaign, it was on climate change. When yesterday Biden came out with his first non-moderate policy, it was on climate change. Almost every one of the 20 candidates is making these bold climate changes. It's definitely part of this election season in a way it never has been before. And it's contagious. You're seeing it at state levels, local levels. All of a sudden, people are listening. And part of it's those grassroots movements of the youth and others. And then part of it is that this Green New Deal, which actually was supported by local organizing. As you can see here, there were 2 protests in front of Nancy Pelosi's office about the Green New Deal, even before it was officially out. But it has changed. And there was a recent poll done by Yale and George Mason University, I believe this was last month, that says the Green New Deal has the support of 81% of registered voters, including nearly 2/3 of Republicans. Did we hear that a few years ago? No. This is exciting because one of the most important things that matters in terms of U.S. climate action for local governments is people voting for not just their mayors, but state representatives, senators, and president. And if you guys have more questions about what the Green New Deal is and isn't, we can bring those up in the Q&A. But I want to move on. Let's get local with Philadelphia. Philadelphia, like other cities, are showing new types of leadership. Remember I mentioned earlier there was this box, oh, well, we get our electricity from these people, and so we'll just do energy audits on our buildings, which is great, but, wah. And, we may do this, we may do that. We can only deal with one challenge at a time. Cities are looking at new tools, working with new partners, are integrating in equity, and are combining projects in a way that we hadn't seen before. So in Philadelphia, I'm going to give an example and then a Salt Lake City example. Did I ruin your audio? I got excited. Okay. I mentioned I get excited very easily, so much so that for you people who can't see me, I broke something. Okay. Okay. So Philadelphia, led by the Philadelphia Energy Authority, which is quasi-public, quasi-private entity, which I can also describe in detail. Like it was set up to allow for certain procurement that city government can't do, and it's leading a lot of the private sector energy work in Philadelphia, focused on small businesses and residents, etc. They came out with Solarize Philly program. Have you guys in the room heard of Solarize Philly? So Solarize Philly, there's Solarize programs across the country. The idea is bulk purchasing of solar equipment and the time for solar developers to bring down the price of solar to make it a little less expensive, although, rooftop solar on a household is still going to be ridiculously expensive. Says someone who, I'm getting one of the largest solar installations on a residential rooftop, and that's why I have to work extra hard because it costs more than I would like it to. But what Solarize Philly did was 2 things. On one hand, it made everyone pay just a little bit more to put a fund to help bring down the prices further for lower and middle income households. Of course, that wasn't too successful because it still requires paying money. And if you're low, moderate income, you don't have that extra money lying around. But separately, job creation and workforce training were central parts of the design of the program. So there's this estimate that Solarize Philly will create 75 jobs, and Philadelphia Energy Authority with the city and others wanted to make sure Philadelphians were prepared to join this growing industry. So starting not last August, the August before, they had 18 students completed an inaugural Find Your Power solar training program, which was the first solar job training program offered through the school district of Philadelphia. And it's targeting high schools where the kids don't historically have opportunities to either go to college or historically maybe didn't know of energy careers. So it's opening a new opportunity and potential career path for students who beforehand didn't even know this existed. And then the idea is that then after being trained, they would be hired and hopefully be one of these 75 jobs created by the Solarized Philly. But it gets even cooler because then Philly, as part of achieving its municipal goals, said, you know, we've been doing a lot to do energy efficiency, but we know we really need cleaner electricity. If we wait for the state grids to get cleaner, we're not going to get there. So what's within our power? So they actually put out requests for proposals to the solar industry and are in the process of signing a contract for a solar power purchase agreement. So what this means is that a brand new solar farm in Adams County, Philadelphia, just a little bit north of here, is going to be created thanks to the city's contract. It's 70 megawatts. It will be the largest solar installation in the state of Philadelphia. To put in perspective, the current largest one, I think, is 12 or 14 megawatts. So this is significantly bigger. It's local. It's in the region. And perhaps they'll be hiring some of the students who were just trained here in Philadelphia. Here's a job with a real company building, really catalyzing the renewable energy and solar industry in the region, if not the state. Oh, and by the way, not only is it going to meet 20% of the city's municipal energy requirements for electricity, it's cheaper than what they currently pay for electricity, right? Like, that's so perfect. So there's more examples like that. Let's keep going. Salt Lake City. I love Salt Lake City for so many reasons. Salt Lake City is in Utah. Not a liberal bastion. It tends to be pretty red, although very practical red, if I should say so myself. So there are two, for those of you who are not familiar with how electricity markets work, some states are vertically integrated. That's considered regulated, which means your electric utility is either generating or purchasing all the electricity for you, as well as delivering it to you. Other states are deregulated, and this was happening in the 90s. A bunch of states deregulated with the thought that, hey, if we have more competition in who generates electricity and who we could buy electricity from, maybe prices would come down. We haven't fully seen that, but anyway, we have a country where we have some states that are deregulated, like Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts. There's that competition. And then we have the regulated states, like Utah. So Salt Lake City partnered with other local governments in the area who are also interested in 100% renewable energy, because they realized that by the state's renewable power portfolio standard, which is basically what the state is saying utilities have to bring to its customers in terms of renewable energy, was very low. It was only, I think, 20% by 2025 or something along those lines. They're never going to achieve their renewable energy goals that way. And even if they put solar on everything, solar is maybe going to get them. I haven't seen their statistics, but it's normally somewhere between 5, 10, 15% of total electricity needs. So they worked across city boundaries, across municipal boundaries, Summit County, Park City, Salt Lake City, and they worked with their utility. They said, you know, instead of us always fighting each other, let's come to an agreement. You have objectives, you have needs, you have certain business standards that you have to create, you have to achieve, and we have our goals, clean energy plus a bunch of others. How can we come to an agreement where we can all meet our goals, be financially in a good place, and still move forward? So they came up with an agreement and together went to the state, because for Rocky Mountain Power to be able to purchase 100% green electricity on behalf of those entities who want it, they actually didn't have the power to do that without state legislation. So they together went to the state. The utility and the local governments together went to the state. And just a few weeks ago, Governor Gary Herbert, at a ceremonial signing, talked about the Community Renewable Act, HB 411, which is legislation that passed to enable the next steps towards a net 100% renewable electricity portfolio by 2030 for the Utah communities who want it. So that's a new type of partnership. Where have we seen local government partnering with a utility that's not a municipally owned utility and together going to the state? I'm going to look at you at this one, Patrick, working with the utilities together to go to the state to change legislation to enable what has to be done. I love that. every local government that I'm working with WRI and RMI, they all are like, how do we do what Salt Lake City did? It wasn't easy. It took 3 to 4 years. And by the way, the next step that's allowed is figuring out, well, what are the tariffs and what does this look like? We're still a long way till the RFPs for procurement even happen, but it's a really important step. Okay, I promise there's not that many more because there's so many. There's growth in regional climate collaboration. In fact, the Institute for Sustainable Energy recently came out with a report on the growth of regional climate collaboration. I'm going to focus on one that isn't in that report, but it's near and dear to my heart because it's local. The city of Philadelphia is leading a group of cities, about 17 of them, that are all part of the same Regional Transmission Organization, RTO. So just stepping back a second, the entire United States is divided into a few regional transmission areas or independent system operators that are responsible for ensuring supply and demand in the regional grid is balanced. So they're kind of managing the grid. Number one, and number two, they're setting the rules for how the market works and how it's valuing certain types of electricity from certain sources and what those rules look like. So it has a big say in how the market accepts renewable power or doesn't, what gets prioritized, what doesn't, how storage fits in, how it's priced. All of that is decided by the RTOs and ISOs. So the one for Philadelphia is this whole swath colored here on this. And it's called PJM, Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland. But as you can see, it goes all the way out to Illinois, includes Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Washington, D.C., parts of Virginia, West Virginia. It, in fact, is the largest RTO, not by geographic space, but in terms of customers, I think in the world. And it represents 25% of energy customers in the U.S. It's a powerful one. And the city of Philadelphia said, you know what? We want to be decision makers at the table. We want to inform how these market rules are created and making sure the long-term planning for the grid aligns with our goals. But we know, we little Philadelphians aren't going to have much of a say. But you know what? We're going to get all our friends together. The 17 of the largest cities in this area, which are pretty big. And then we hope to grow it. And maybe it's not just municipalities. Maybe eventually we include large universities, maybe even some states and others, and figure out how we can get a seat at the table to be part of this decision planning that happens, this decision making and planning that happens. And there are certain processes that exist in terms of membership and voting in these, and they're going to work with a consultant to figure out exactly what's that look like and how to institutionalize that. That's a new type of regional collaboration, and that's really thinking outside the box. Speaking of renewable energy, more and more renewable energy programs are saying, you know what, it's not just for wealthy people like Leonardo DiCaprio and Mark Ruffalo to put on their roofs, or Ariel and Marin. I'm not wealthy, but I hope to have solar. It should be for everyone, should have access to solar, whether or not they're a renter, whether or not they have roof space or not. Community solar is a structure that allows you to own part of a solar installation that's not in your roof. It's not allowed in every state. Guess what? It's not allowed in Pennsylvania yet, but there's legislation on that, so call your representatives. But separately, it is allowed in New York and a lot of other places, and it's growing. But what's really interesting is so many of them are focused on access to renewable energy for low and moderate income households, whether or not they're renters or homeowners, whether they have a roof near them or don't. They have the opportunity not just to obtain the renewable energy and be part of something, but that's ownership. That's a financial asset. That's empowering. That's flipping the triangle as opposed to giving money to the utilities, which, by the way, are doing really well, and the fossil fuel companies. That money is going to the owners, the shareholders of this community solar. So their economic opportunity around that is pretty huge, and we're seeing more of these pop up. So here's a flyer for one in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, put out by one of my favorite environmental justice groups, Uprose, led by Elizabeth Yampierre, who has been fighting a good fight for a really long time. And seeing the fruits of that labor come out is very exciting. It's not just renewable energy. Even the way we're talking about transportation is different. We're not just saying, hey, bike lanes for the hipsters and millennials who are moving into cities. It's actually about equitable mobility for everyone. And if you actually look and see where bike lanes are, where bike share stations are, where transit is, where areas are more walkable, they tend to be pretty inequitable. This is something I think the Carbon Free Boston Equity Report did really well with spelling this out with specific numbers, and it's pretty heartbreaking when you see it. So shifting the conversation, not about, hey, how do we just get chargers for EVs out so people with EVs can charge, but thinking about how do we ensure everybody has access to equitable mobility that's carbon free, and making sure we're thinking about where we're putting EV charging capacity, how we're funding and supporting market transformation, if we're doing that at all, but also where we're putting bike lanes. It's worth saying, since we're in Philadelphia, Philadelphia is considered to have the most equitable bike share program in the country. They'll say it's because they didn't act first. They watched others, they learned from others, and then figured out how to do it better, including partnering with community groups, doing computer literacy program, and tying that in with bike share. So not only were they learning how to use the app as part of learning computer literacy, but they were also having the opportunity to learn how to ride bikes. I love that story. Okay, back to the political. As I was saying earlier, the fact that we're seeing clean energy as something that's part of campaigns is huge. What's even more huge is that 7 gubernatorial candidates in this past election in 2018 who ran campaigning for 100% renewable electricity, they all won. And what is more interesting is where they are. It's, obviously in New York State, you could win with that. In California, you could win with that. In Vermont, you could win with that. No problem. But let's look at where these states are. Maine, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, that Rust Belt area, very important politically. Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada. This map is so exciting to me. And some, including Nevada, have already moved forward on their promises and have already enacted legislation changing their renewable portfolio standards to be consistent with the campaign goals. But some cities are actually achieving their 100% renewable energy maps. And again, it's not just north, not just south, not east and west. Look how many are in the middle. This one's really off the map. This one is actually in Alaska, but it didn't fit on my map. And this one's Burlington, Vermont, which isn't surprising. They have a municipal electric utility, which makes things a little easier. But look, we have Texas, Kansas, Missouri. Colorado's not as surprising, but this is an exciting map. And these are the ones who've already achieved 100% renewable energy. Like, it's already happening. What's interesting is the community in Alaska, their current engagement rating in my database is 0 because they just haven't signed up for any commitments, but they're 100% renewable. So right there, we see the bias and challenges with my database. Okay, and this is the last one, because this is the one that everyone loves to ask me about since I spent some time in New York, although I had nothing to do with this suite of bills that are part of the Climate Mobilization Act that was passed and signed this past spring in New York City. There are so many lessons learned, good and bad, dirty and ugly, around what it takes to move climate action mobilization forward in a really interesting ways. But before we get into that, or maybe we shouldn't get into it, this is the first of its kind, first in the entire world, city setting a mandate on building performance of existing buildings with climate targets, with greenhouse gas emissions targets. The first. No one has this. We have such targets for new construction, but not for existing buildings. Why? Because it's really hard. And that's partially why it was such a contentious process to get here. And a lot of people don't like it and thinks it's, of course, if everyone liked it, then we did something wrong, right? To do something this big and ambitious, it has to make people unhappy, and it's going to cost a lot of money, but it's also going to create a lot of jobs and really be something for all the other cities with these climate goals across the country and across the world to really learn from. In short, sorry, before I move on, I want to say pushed in part by non-city groups. The city came out with something that was very aggressive. Everyone balked, said you didn't work with us, that's not realistic. A whole coalition of people who are not the city came together, worked with consultants, had something, gave to city council. The city's like, hey, what about us? They eventually talked, they came together, and they moved forward. That is very simplified, but I think it's important because cities can't lead alone. They need to be pushed. If they're left in their little bubble, you'll end up with something very technocratic and may not work for folks, and no one's going to vote for it, and no one's going to support it. You need everyone, not everyone. You need many voices at the table. You need the right voices at the table. You need it to be equitable, and you need that coalition of voters and organizations pushing the city and supporting. And maybe you come up with a happy medium as opposed to nothing. I think that is, to me, the most important lesson of this really messy suite of bills. But what it does is it sets increasingly harsh limits on carbon emissions for buildings over 25,000 square feet beginning in 2024. It creates an Office of Building Energy and Emissions Performance and an advisory board, that coalition, who is going to be part of the process and at the table, and will work with the Department of Buildings to both regulate and enforce new standards. The new law takes effect in 2024, and emissions from qualifying buildings will need to be reduced. Emissions, not building utilization intensity, not building energy intensity, but emissions will need to be reduced 40% by 2030 and then 80% by 2050. It's emissions, which means renewable energy is part of it. Offsets, I believe, are going to be part of it. Carbon trading is going to be part of it, and a lot of other things to help get there. Okay, so this is sort of what that time frame looks like. You see the laws enacted. You see there's all these steps that have to happen, including talking about carbon trading and reports and rules, and emissions limits don't begin until 2024. But this is messy and it's confusing, and so much is left to be figured out, such as, oh my gosh, affordable housing and all the regulatory challenges related to that. But hey, it's moving forward and everybody's watching. Everybody's watching, just like they're all watching New York City on congestion pricing. These are big things. And I think while people in other cities across the country like to remind me that they're not New York City and New York City can do things we can't do, that may be true. But this was risky. And kudos to everyone who took the risk to de-risk it for everyone else. So New York City may fall on its face, but we can't be afraid to fail trying because we have so much work to do. We just can't wait to make sure it's perfect. And we all have a lot to learn. I have so much to learn. We all have a lot to learn. I would like to learn a little from you guys. I know there's not many of you here, so I am going to ask you to help out. I hope you don't mind. But also online, I hear there's people online. What's inspiring you? What do you see are the opportunities or seedlings sprouting that you think could be part of helping local governments and then globally us all achieve our goals?
I think we should thank you first. For
okay. I just talked straight for 90 minutes. I'm so tired of my voice.
Thank you for doing that. All of that. It's like the frame, but let's the people in the room or the people online. I'm waiting to get questions online.
I guess I can make a comment and listen to your response. Like, one thing that you said about the 30% emissions reductions was that it was sort of easy because it was a market-based, market-motivated decision. But that the anticipation is that the other reductions would not be easy. I appreciate that perspective. I am curious what role you think technological change could have in facilitating easier transitions or other aspects of emissions reductions as well.
That's a fantastic question because the way you framed it was right on. What we're finding in some of these local government carbon neutrality plans or 80 by 50 plans is that all the strategies we need to achieve our goals exist, but we need transformational change to financial markets, to institutions, to regulatory frameworks, to yada, 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 to actually get that. And these are systemic shifts are challenging. As my colleague Catherine likes to say, paradigm shifts, whatever that may mean. But you're exactly right. The role of technological innovation to make it easier to do it, if we could figure out how to get to those whole building deep retrofits plus electrification without people having to move out of their homes or without it costing as much money, that's a game changer. One of the technological solutions, right, we want to be performance-based, but one of the technologies for row homes here in Philadelphia is air source heat pumps. I happen to have one because we were doing a gut renovation. We didn't have air conditioning. We had to redo HVAC system. It actually made somewhat sense. It isn't going to make sense for most people right now unless they're doing a major renovation or something else. But how can our heat pump technologies or how we install them get better and cheaper and easier? That's a big part of it. I mentioned up front one of my projects was with Sidewalk Labs. It's actually a subsidiary of Google Alphabet. And they came up with this preface of, what if we built a city from scratch or a district from scratch that was built from the internet up? There's so much we could do with data and technology, both data-related technology and sensors, as well as sustainable infrastructure. How would we design it to help us achieve these climate positive goals in their case, and equity and quality of life and access to jobs? What would that look like? And the whole premise for some of the venture capital funding they're doing in some of their work is that exact idea. Another great example, I'm just giving examples, I'm not actually answering the question because I don't know answers to anything, just more questions and interesting anecdotes. We talked earlier about zero waste, right? And right now, when I tell anyone I do something related to climate or green, they'll go, oh, well, I recycle. But recycling is a pain in the butt, right? You have to do it, it's dirty, you drag it out. If you drag it out too early, the raccoons will get to it. My neighbors, their tenant put trash in front of my house. I got fined for other people's trash. It's a pain in the butt. Plus, you have to think about it. Like, if you're upstairs and you finish a roll of toilet paper and you have the little cardboard, and you're like, am I going to recycle this? Like, I don't have recycling in here. And then you think about the composting and this and that. The whole thinking of some of the things Sidewalk Labs is doing is, why are we making people do things behaviorally? What if the easiest, most convenient thing was actually the greenest thing? Like, if you didn't actually have to do anything to separate trash, or you didn't have to drag anything out, it was right there, and right away, their technology was there to give you the right pricing signals, to give you the nudges, but also, from your sink, you had your in-building anaerobic digesters and your autonomous vehicles then, move the compost and digest it separate from the methane that was collected to, all these different things that could happen. If technology is able to make it easy, convenient, and less expensive, that's great. What does concern me, and I say this even though I'm involved with a few smart technology plans and studies, is sometimes technology is promoted and data is promoted for the sake of data and technology. So I think we always have to make sure we're stepping back and asking ourselves, what problem are we trying to solve? What do we want to be able to do better and faster, and why? So it's not technology and innovation for technology and innovation's sake, but to really help us deal with these specific challenges, which I'm sure is what you had in mind. But it's amazing how I think others sometimes forget that.
Since you talked about data, I want to ask you a question about data. So the data that you showed is not what it's what I expected. It's not, we're moving slowly. We're not moving anywhere near fast enough. But you also said that we're also shifting away from the really precise indicators, like greenhouse gas emissions, and we're talking more in a sort of coarser way about things that touch on people's quality of life, things that people can relate to personally, but may not be the things that the bean counters who are in the climate heaven are thinking about, right? So I wonder, is there a problem there? In other words, or do we need two tracks? Do we need a track which is sort of the indicators that speak to people so that they vote in the right ways and that they make behavioral change voluntarily that makes the most sense? and another set of indicators that's getting even more precise than we were in the past when we were already nerdy and nobody understood us, right? To get at those specific, because, you know, I'm very curious about how well any of that stuff is reported.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it already looks bad, but I'm generally an optimist, but the data person in me says, from the data that I analyze, the data stinks, and it's even worse than that. So I'm very curious on sort of like reporting and indicators and data.
Yeah. So I think, just to be clear, I don't think we're fully yet moving away from the greenhouse gas is the indicator of all indicators approach, but there's this new growing awareness that, hey, we need to remember the people and we need to consider new indicators. I don't think most people are there yet at all. I think this is in the last year or two, people being like, wait a second, it's not just about greenhouse gas initiative. So I think it's very new, and I don't think yet we have a good sense of what those new indicators should be, and maybe they're context specific. But what I have heard some cities who are grappling with this say that it's a bit of front of house, back of house, just like you said. It's we're going to talk to you about some of our, you know, the leading indicators or other indicators. The greenhouse gas emission is also a very lagging indicator. It doesn't really tell you what's happening on the ground. It's a few years out of date always. It's lagging other trends that are happening. But what are some of those more upstream indicators or more pressing indicators that relate to our lives, such as, you know, average commute length, which has an impact on greenhouse gas emissions, but also, you know, I can relate to. Things like that. I think the city of Vancouver is probably the furthest ahead in thinking through what are some of these new indicators. They're analyzing that right now, and they want to figure out what are the most revealing indicators to give a better sense of what's actually happening and what people are experiencing, as opposed to just this lagging indicator that's really not meaningful to anyone. They're not getting rid of the greenhouse gas indicator, because we need that baseline, that commonality, but perhaps it's back of house. The City of Philadelphia Greenworks is a great example, because remember when I mentioned their vision, which isn't actually an indicator, but it can turn into an indicator when they talk about let's waste less, so, you know, volume generated, and have cleaner streets, and there's indices that look at litter on the streets, but they still have a zero waste goal, but that's their back of the house goal. You know, they're still working towards zero waste, but to others, they're making sure they're meeting their priorities and are communicating and being accountable to how we're doing on litter and reducing waste tonnage. So it's about both. The other thing you said is 100% right. All this data is terrible. Access to good data is so challenging. Anyone who's worked with any local government to do a greenhouse gas inventory knows that you have to make so many assumptions because the data is always awful, all over the place, and inconsistent. I think the city with the best data at this point is New York City, because they spent so much money and had so much work doing so many different analyses, and because they've had the benchmarking ordinance in effect for so long and have that level of information from their buildings. But it's tough, and it was a long way getting there. When I was at DCAS, Department of Citywide Administrative Services, and we were leading by example by complying with the benchmarking rules first, and not just for buildings over 50,000 square feet, but for all my buildings over 10,000 square feet, working with 29 operating agencies where my agency didn't control or own most of those buildings. You know, we had the utility data to work off, which is also a little imperfect, but fuel oil, there was no central repository for fuel oil data. I mean, and the fuel oil is so relatively dirty compared to everything else that's a huge discrepancy in how it comes, and we have to make some big assumptions until the data collection got better and a new metering and monitoring process was able to be put in place. But it's just messy, and it's long-term to clean it up. So data is imperfect to begin with. Where some cities are struggling, especially those who do their greenhouse gas emissions, and every few years they do a climate adaptation plan, they're like, oh my God, we're spending so much time on analysis and bean counting. There's like paralysis by analysis. They're like, we just want to work on implementation. There's so much work to do. We just need to stop planning and counting and just doing. We're all small offices, limited resources. We're not getting the resources to hire that many more people. at some point, we just have to be okay with our imperfect data. Not that we don't try to improve it, but we really need to focus on the conversations we have to have, the policies we need to move as well. So I think that's an important perspective to keep in mind too, that there's this interest in better data by many, but then some of the cities who have the best data are like, okay already, we need to get moving. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the next generation climate action plans that many of them are working on.
Yeah, to put this together with the previous question, it's really interesting that we can sort of fine tune, if you think about like an infrastructure program that has this, there are all these different phases of the life cycle, the procurement of the materials, the sourcing of the materials, the transport of the materials that you need for this project, and then the construction of the project and the operation and maintenance of the project and the ultimate decommissioning of the project, and then by understanding life cycle assessment, we've increased the amount of data, we've increased the amount of bad data that we need. And so if the discussion becomes about let's nickel and dime this and get just the right material selection and change, swap out that piece of plastic for this piece of PVC, because we think we're having, I think we're going to get into that paralysis by analysis, whereas if the discussion becomes more transformational on the technological side, where like we just don't use things. There's just certain things that are not used. There are certain things that are sourced locally. There are certain, sort of bulk decisions that we know no matter how they quantitatively impact will drop everything. That becomes a more interesting, at least in my opinion, a more interesting discussion to have. So it's a. I just feel like the tweaking what we've been doing to try to make it a little bit better is going to be so much effort that it almost begs whether a revolutionary change in what we do is actually easier, which I've never heard myself or anybody else say that in the past.
It's just like that famous quote that we didn't get to the light bulb by tweaking the candle. I love that quote, which resonates with almost every aspect of climate action, but the data part is part of that as well, for sure.
Yeah, so it's just a really fantastic talk, and
Thank you.
You went over a lot of really cool things going on in mitigation strategies, but even if by some miracle we do hit those really aggressive goals, there's still adaptation issues to deal with. So are those also happening on a local versus federal versus international?
Yes, so I shouldn't call it my database, the database funded by Summit and CERDNA in partnership with my city-scale partners. It actually includes climate adaptation programs as well. And so that's just on the data, but anecdotally, I almost see those are happening faster and faster, especially after 2017 and 2018, which just had so many catastrophic climate events that it's becoming really real to some people. I mean, the statistics are so scary. And the realization that even if we do everything, we already have some climate adaptation locked in is being felt. With the funding, support, and technical resources from 100 resilient cities, 100 cities around the globe had some technical support to do climate adaptation plans. That was funded by Rockefeller Foundation, and actually I think by Bloomberg as well. They actually ended up having 101 cities, the last one being Houston after the flood. And they had a similar framework that they followed. How do we think of people and equity? And I think one of the goals, they don't say this out loud, but I heard folks say it, was to really build this, the profession and the community of excellence around adaptation planning, and bring it into city governments. And different city governments some of them have a chief resilience officer, some of them, their chief sustainability officer also does resilience. Sometimes their resilience officer also does sustainability, where the two of them come together, differs from place to place. But there is some really interesting things that are coming out, and a few key findings that have come out. And a big part of that, and we're seeing it locally with a few plans that are coming, is how important it is for community-based planning when it comes to resilience, for a number of reasons. Not only does climate change impact, communities and communities differently. For example, there are some neighborhoods in Philadelphia that are, 20 or 40 degrees hotter? No, 20 degrees hotter on certain days compared to other neighborhoods in the city. Like we feel heat differently based on where we are in as it relates to the rivers, buildings, highways, tree cover. So that's one reason for community-based planning. Number two, the people who live in the community, they already know how they deal with things. When electricity goes out or it's really hot, people in the community are like, oh, we do this. They understand how it works, and it's the community and civic infrastructure that actually enhances resilience. So that's one exciting trend. I heard publicly announced by the city of Philadelphia at an event I went to last week here in Philadelphia that they're scoping out a process to do a Philadelphia climate adaptation plan that is going to be neighborhood based, and that's their plan. So we're seeing that, number one. Number two, another finding is that, similar to what we were saying here, you have to work beyond at different scales. So there's, the building scale, the community scale, the city scale, but then the regional scale. The challenges don't stop at a geographic tax boundary or a geographic city boundary. We have to move beyond that. So I think a lot of cities are understanding that and are working towards that in really creative ways. The overlay between resilience and energy, I love, energy plus storage. Solar plus storage is something that a lot of cities are looking into and a lot of research is happening. And does that change the economics for on-site solar? Should every airport near water have a floating solar barge with battery backup? What does that look like in those opportunities? So that's really exciting as well. I think it's easier for communities and advocates to get around the adaptation side because it's so real and we're already feeling it. And it's to avoid pain, while when they think of mitigation, it's, are you going to cause me pain? And so the ability to mix the two together, to actually have planning that puts together mitigation and adaptation together, I personally think is the most powerful. But it's amazing how many local governments, whether it's for political reasons or financial reasons, continue to separate them, which I think impacts the messaging and narrative.
On that point, I wonder if you share a feeling that I've had recently, is that the adaptation discussion, which is so critically important, though, at some point it's getting us away from, if you adapt, you somehow feel like you've done your part. I think there's that where the sort of existential challenge is the net zero carbon neutrality goal, and I'm concerned at some point that the discussion about adaptation eclipses the discussion about mitigation, when one, where the former is really a response to something that you see as the tragedy of the commons. It's bigger than what I can deal with personally. My little piece doesn't matter. Whereas really it's the opposite. It's death by a thousand cuts. If you don't, if we're not having the individual mitigation discussion collectively, we're missing the point. So I've had a little concern lately about like too much adaptation discussion, not enough mitigation discussion.
This is so real. There was this fantastic article that recently came out. I wish I could remember the name of the journalist. She did this little study with the real estate industry in Miami Beach. By research is she put on fancy clothes and she pretended she wanted to buy one of the fancy luxury apartments that have been sprouting up all over Miami Beach, which if you look at any type of climate map, just doesn't seem like a great investment. And it was a very humorous article because she spoke about, how they kept getting better looking and the buildings were more and more amazing. And she would pretend to be interested, and then she would pose some questions about, well, what about climate change and rising sea levels and storms? And they all had the same answer, like, oh yeah, flooding was a problem, but the city fixed it. We had these new bridges and they lifted everything. We had these flood barriers, and they were all able, because they're real estate agents, to say specifically how the city solved it. And it was really scary because they're selling it. Real estate agents know how to sell, and they were selling this, and it's exactly that. I haven't heard, at least from the local governments I spoke to, but then again, they tend to be the more progressive ones. They themselves don't have that confusion, but I think as part of the narrative, it's really scary, and it's where it's so wonky. But the understanding between a 1.5 degree Celsius warming and 2%, the speed, scale, and irreversible quality of a 2.0, I think, not 2.8, 2 degrees, is what most people don't understand. And the two examples that I've tried on people, so I was telling you about my vacation earlier, and one of the people on the trip, who is not a friend of mine, he's a libertarian, and he decided that while we're all on vacation together, he wanted to have intellectual conversations about why all regulations and subsidies are bad. And so we spent the whole time talking about climate change, but I got him because I was explaining how I used coral and then the moose in Maine and Vermont who are being attacked by ticks, and they're dying because of ticks, right? And if climate change and warming happen so fast, the moose don't have time to adapt to the fact that they have this new predator they never had before, these ticks, right? But if we can slow things down, the moose can adapt and evolve over time. Because he was saying, aren't we all going to evolve? We evolve anyway. That's what the ecosystem does. But this whole concept of it's not fast enough, this is why people love the polar bears. If you could talk about the coral and the moose, like people are like, oh, we don't care about the people, but we care about the moose. And it for some reason, that resonated. I don't know if that answered your question, but it is something we're seeing for lay people, but not necessarily for the local governments who are working on this.
I'm going to keep asking questions. If you don't mind.
I don't mind.
I'll let you go in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Get out of the room. But I'll just bundle this together. So very interesting stats on the small towns.
Mm-hmm.
The villages are 50-50 more or less in there. And your other point of, well, it's great to hear about all these, we are still in movements and sort of consortia of local governments getting together in sort of in defiance of federal government and trying to organize. But then your point being that they are limited. They can get together, they can put pressure, they can arouse sort of public voter interests, but they are still limited. So the two questions are, A, can you give a few examples of, I mean, I can guess some, but I'm wondering if you've got some practical examples of like a city that really wanted to do something but couldn't because of the, within the domain of what the city can do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then two, how do we take those 50% of the villages that are red villages
Mm-hmm.
and elevate them to,
Mm-hmm.
to sort of set the national agenda?
I feel like if there was one takeaway from those slides, it's that we need them. I know that wasn't your full question, but I think that part is exactly right. So it was an example where a city wanted to do something and it couldn't. Oh, there's so many of them. I mean, if we use New York City as an example, the first time it tried to move forward with congestion pricing, which a lot of transportation models have shown is the number one way of getting people out of their cars. It's not necessarily improvements to transit. It's definitely not more bike lanes or more walkability, or those are great. We want those. But the number one way to get people out of their cars, lower vehicle mileage travel, and therefore actually reduce transportation greenhouse gas emissions is congestion pricing. So New York City first unveiled this idea in 2007 as part of the original Plan YC. I think they did an excellent job of actually creating a coalition of environmental justice groups, environmental groups, housing advocates, city council, real estate, Chamber of Commerce type organizations like Partnership for New York, all coming together, making the case for congestion pricing, spoke to every single neighborhood and every single council member in the city. The city council members said, this is great, but putting a fee, that type of fee, the city can't decide just to do fee. The city doesn't have say over taxes and fees. They need permission from the state. This had to go to state government for approval on congestion pricing. And at the end of the day, it came to the famous three white men in a room of New York State government at the time. I should mention I'll get to that point in a bit. We needed 2 out of 3 of them to vote for congestion pricing to allow New York City to move forward with this plan, which, by the way, would put billions of funding, much needed, into transit, to expand transit, number one, but number two, even bring it up to a state of good repair and have all these other fantastic implications that would help everyone, including access, mobility access for those people who had limited transit access at the time. So all good. But 2 out of 3 failed to pass congestion pricing for the city, even though this is at New York State. And I should mention both those two people, I believe, are in jail now, or at least have spent some time in jail. A lot of turnover in government, so, you know, I don't want to get too much into New York State politics, but there's an example. Move forward a decade, and it's actually the state, the governor, pushing for congestion pricing, and then the mayor's like, I don't know if I want to do this, I don't want to do it. You know, the mayor and the governor, they both have these national aspirations and are big names, and, you know, sometimes those don't go together well. And so, you know, they weren't working together on this, but congestion got so bad in New York. So many people were pushing it, especially with the rise in rideshare. You know, for a while we were saying transit ridership is growing, it's growing. Well, actually then it started decreasing and congestion became even a bigger problem. And I don't know if you've been to New York lately, but it's terrible. Like, I love the city of New York. I thought of it almost like a part of my family. I hate going to Manhattan now. It's so congested and gross because of all these cars. And so finally they're like, yes, we have to do congestion pricing. And now, you know, it's moving forward and everyone's on board 12 years later. But imagine if we did it in 2007, it would have gone into effect in like 2009, 2010, it would be such a different conversation right now. So that's my favorite example. Also a great example of coalition building, and if we did that level of coalition building for all the work a city wanted to do, especially today, you know, with the existing building mandate, I mean, I think it would have been a very different process.
All right. We've allowed you to go on to the whole thing, so thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you guys for staying.